Hi, welcome. So today we'll be discussing Fordham's Gender and Vulnerability, and this is made by me, Sucharita Gumala. So before we can really talk about gender and vulnerability, we have to first discuss what exactly is a vulnerability perspective. When we think about vulnerability, we think about how people are susceptible to disasters such as a hurricane or a tornado, let's say hitting someone's house. But in this case, that's not exactly the type of disaster we're referring to or the state of vulnerability that people end up being in. Vulnerability perspective deals with something else. The vulnerability perspective deals with the social outcomes of a disaster occurring and leaving a certain area or a class of people vulnerable to something from a disaster that has occurred. The vulnerability perspective tries to focus on is shifting the focus of action from after a disaster has occurred response to before a disaster will occur response. So in other words, it's trying to fix a more disaster-prone area or society to be able to handle the outcome of whatever disaster strikes. However, the problem with this is that people tend to focus solely on solving the issue by focusing on the issue instead of focusing on other factors that may help solve the issue in a more resourceful and reliable way that is also beneficial for the society. Another thing that this can also happen with this is that when trying to fix a disaster-prone society to a less disaster-prone society is that you kind of actually increase the risk of it becoming more vulnerable in the future. Let's look at the example that the book or the article gave us, which is the May of 1998 earthquake in Afghanistan, where responders at this earthquake used a Western approach of providing help for disaster by focusing on their dependence on heavy machine, like finding helicopters and such to assist the local people. When instead, if they were just focused more on the people itself and the factors there instead of the disaster, they would have realized that simply using donkey convoys would have been more efficient and cheaper solution to the problem at hand. So the vulnerability perspective really highlights the social aspects of disaster situations as well as really emphasizing the susceptibility of certain groups of people like the poor. So my first question to you guys is, why do you think it's important to understand the vulnerability perspective? When disasters occur, they bring forth social problems, not just regular problems as well, such as class, race, and gender. The article actually states that between men and women are actually more susceptible and more sensitive to disaster because of deep-seated social processes and other factors that come within the sensitivity of women. So there's actually a theory that goes over the vulnerability of women in disaster-prone situations, which is called the feminist standpoint theory. This theory offers a theoretical explanation as to how since or whenever a disaster strikes, it's usually male management responders who assess the situation, and because it's more male-dominated, there is a focus on women since they are seen as the most vulnerable gender rather than the men. The case for claiming that women have a greater vulnerability is because that throughout time and through general research, there is evidence that women and girls are more disadvantaged through life compared to the men and boys due to women having fewer opportunities than men as a group and as an individual. Women are also viewed as a disadvantaged because they're of the triple role that women tend to have, which is reproduction, production, and community management activism. So reproduction obviously has to do with child care, taking care of the baby and children, the kids at home. Production has to do with cooking, cleaning, and providing a great, clean home for the husband to come to. And community management will be taking care of the house and doing the cleanliness and the housework that women tend to usually do at home. But because women are viewed as very stereotypically supposed to be staying at home, taking care of the kids, and being the mom, they aren't viewed as useful in society. So they do have to deal with reduced educational employment opportunities. They have less political representation and power, and they also have fewer civic freedoms, which all kind of limit their abilities to obtain equal opportunity as men do, which is why they are seen, to be vulnerable and not as capable of handling things as men in society and in disaster situations. So my second question to you guys is, why do you think that women and girls are at a disadvantage when compared to the men and boys in society? The article describes two ways to look at gender, and it is by separating men and women and looking at each group individually. However, when you separate genders like that and look at them distinctly, there are many factors that come forth, such as all the history with women and them being subordinate to men and being lesser than men in history-wise, which will give them the title as victim, no matter what. However, separating the identities of men and women is a great way to dissect the vulnerable aspects of both genders and makes it easier to assess problems. There's also argument that gender should not be separated but instead be looked at in unity, since that way individuals can view and critique the actions of both together to assess vulnerability for both genders. Going back to the idea of singling out women, where their past history comes into play, such as how they used to be critiqued and pushed down in history where they weren't given rights and such like that, it really brings forth the idea of victim and how men have always been viewed as the superior ones in society while the women are seen as the inferior ones. So that's another reason why as to women are susceptible to vulnerability in society more and still are considered to be weak, in other words, in society. So instead of singling out women and viewing only their vulnerabilities and flaws in a disaster-prone society, the article talks about equitable inequality, which talks about the inclusion of assessing men into vulnerability perspective, so it reflects the needs, strengths, and unity of both genders, which will eventually lead to a more equal society gender-wise. So my last and final question is just a general question about the article as a whole, and it's, why do you think that this article focused more on women than men?